Texas Fight, Book 8 of the America Fall series. Written by Scott Medbury. Narrated by Adam Barr. Copyright 2022, Scott Medbury. All rights reserved. Episode 1. Chapter 1, July 7th. Jack contemplated the flat river stone in his hand. Its surface was smooth, but one side was marred by a long, shallow chip, as if it had been struck by a ricocheting bullet, revealing the lighter stone inside. He was sitting in the long grass with his legs outstretched, looking out over Grace Lake and the endless line of trees beyond, the Sam Houston National Forest. He pulled his hand back and launched the stone out across the wind-chopped water. As he had nearly every day since Grandpa had saved their bacon in his old fighter plane 6 months before, Jack dwelled on the memories of those he had lost. While on the run, it hadn't been so bad. But life in camp wasn't so hectic, and it was easy to get caught up in regrets and grief during quiet moments. The loss of his mom and dad was more about just missing them. But the others? Well, there was shame and bitterness at himself for those. There was Danny, his best friend, who had fought by his side to rescue Katie from the psycho Dawson and was killed for his trouble. Whenever Jack asked himself the question about whether he could have kept him alive by doing things just a little differently, the answer was almost certainly yes. And then there was Katie herself. The grief for his sister burnt differently, seasoned with guilt that churned in the pit of his soul, not relenting even for a day. Jack tried everything: long walks, helping out in the camp, reading, hunting, but nothing worked. Long night watches were even worse. Staring out into the dark between the trees, he'd hallucinate Katie emerging, only to blink it away in an instant. She'd died because of him. Had he been smarter, Katie would still be alive today, and that was an indisputable fact. During his time in Grandpa's camp, Jack's anger and hatred of the invaders had escalated and simmered just below the surface, rising during quiet moments like this. He picked up another stone and hurled it into the water. "Going to war on the lake, too, huh?" Jack turned and saw Jen strolling up to a spot on the shore, hands in her pockets. "Are they mad I ran off?" Jack asked. Jen shrugged. "Not really. Grandpa figured you'd be out here." "Sure." "Not kidding," she said, taking a place in the grass next to him. "They're worried about you, and they get it. We've all lost family." "Well, your cousin Robert is still breathing, isn't he?" Jen's face fell, and he immediately apologized. "I'm sorry, Jen. That was mean and dumb. I'm a crummy friend." "It's okay. I know you didn't mean it. And yeah, you sure are hard work sometimes," she said with a grin. He grinned back. "You'll always have Robert and me," she said more seriously. "But I don't just want us to be tag-alongs until you shoot yourself in the head." Jack jerked his head around, shocked by the blunt language. "No chance of that. I know. Sorry, that was rude. But Jack, this isn't just a bad weekend. This is the occupation, and we're on the run from the Chinese army. Anyone who said they haven't contemplated suicide would be lying." She put a hand on his. "But we still have each other, right?" "Right," Jack sighed, stretching out his legs and rubbing his eyes. "Sorry. Bad day." "Sure. You seem to have more than your fair share." "Give me a break," he said, grinning at the sly dig. "I'm not that bad." Jen smirked. Come on, dust yourself off and walk back with me. It'll be dark by the time we get back. Jack and Jen got up, dusting themselves off, and cast one last look over the water, inhaling the clean air and the cool approach of twilight. Jack felt much better for his interaction with Jen. "Reckon we'll ever take it back?" he asked, shoving his hands in his pockets as they began walking. "No," Jen replied. "But I think we'll survive." Their slow walk back to the main camp, nestled deep in the heart of the national park, took them off the conventional dirt tracks and small roads, into the trees and over ground that was littered with branches and shrubbery. Now, a solid week into the month of July, the daily temperatures were hitting close to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. As accustomed as he was to the heat of a Californian summer, Jack still didn't enjoy it. His t-shirt was sticking to his back just a few minutes into their walk back to camp. A large shape darted from their left and across the path they were taking, drawing a squeal of surprise from Jen. Jack laughed in delight as the big buck sped off into the trees. "Don't see that every day." "No, you don't," said Jen, leaning against a tree. "I need a drink." He wiped a forearm across his face, drenched in sweat, and pulled a small water flask from his backpack. Jen had done the same, swigging generously from her canteen. Since arriving, Jack had seen his fair share of game, mostly small, but this was the first time he'd seen a deer up close. According to one of the camp's hunters, a 17-year-old with distinctive blonde curly hair who went by the name of Jesse, their population was increasing. And yet Grandpa hadn't approved hunting anything larger than a rabbit for meat, something that seemed to gall Jesse no end. Jack had a feeling they would be making a dent in that deer population as soon as their foraging teams found it harder to find canned foods. They were already casting their net wider than some of them felt safe. "Ever get used to the heat back home?" Jack asked as they rested. Jen shook her head. "Robert's great with the heat, but I grew up in Michigan originally, before moving down to be with the rest of my family. I suck. Anything over 75 kills me." "We escaped to the wrong damn place, then." Jack smiled. "Maybe we need to find a rebel base somewhere north." "Nah, I like it here." She screwed the top of her canteen back on and slipped it back into her backpack. "I mean, I really like it here. We were lucky to find good people." Jack navigated a fallen branch on the forest floor as they resumed their trek. "They are good people," he agreed. "But should we stick around, I mean? Is this right?" Jen stopped and looked at him, with her eyebrows raised. "What?" she asked. They had both picked up the pace a half-mile back, and their breath was hurried. Jack shrugged. "I don't know. Just thinking out loud, I guess. We are so close to Houston. It's dangerous, and I don't see how we can stay forever. We could go north. East, maybe? You've heard the rumors about New York State. If it's true, we'd be safer there." "And what about the people here, huh?" "Yeah, I don't know. Forget it, just bouncing ideas." He carried on walking, with Jen having to play catch-up. After another mile, they arrived at Camp Lisa, the name given to what was essentially their guerrilla base, hidden miles away from open roads with the town of Huntsville to their west. Charlie Lynn, known by all as Grandpa, had helped establish the camp with a sizable group of teenagers and other young survivors in the first month after the invasion began. His wife, Lisa, a woman of Irish descent, had died of the Pyongyang flu during Hell Week, and so in her memory, their camp had been named Lisa. Among the cohort kicking in at an average age of 15, Charlie's only living relative, Haley Lynn, somehow spared from the flu by virtue of her shared genes, was in her early 30s and in charge of the weapons armory. At the outer perimeter of the camp, the eldest patrolled. Grandpa had trained those over 16 in weapons and patrol tactics, If you wanted to sneak into the place, you wouldn't get far without alerting one of the guards. Further in, but still well out from the center, a small cluster of rudely constructed tents and more permanent shelters had been erected. While these housed some supplies, they were actually a booby-trapped decoy in case of an incursion from the enemy. The real camp was 500 yards beyond those. Jack and Jen walked into the center of the camp, through supply tents to the area at the heart of their rebel base. When Jack had first arrived, his jaw had hit the floor. Snaking between each section of tents and shelters ran trenches as deep as 6 feet. It reminded him of those scenes in old war movies, with the design at Camp Lisa only lacking barbed wire and sandbags. "We're concealed deep in the forest, but our presence has to remain undetected," Grandpa had explained to Jack, Robert, and Jen as they took their first tour of the camp back in January. "We spent a month digging these trenches to help us navigate unseen. The supply tents close by are all built with branches and leaves, or the green canvas. Our decoy tents are under heavy foliage, but will be seen first from ground level if an attack ever happens." Jack had found the entire setup impressive. A real operation. Back then, it had given him comfort for the first time since his foster parents had died. It wasn't 4 walls, but it was a sort of home. Only now, with his mind wandering daily to grief, he was beginning to doubt even that. "Hey there. You with us?" Theo, one of the survivors and third in command behind Grandpa and Haley, was a tall, dark-haired kid a year older than Jack, and taller by an inch. He was popular and respected in camp and was always busy getting his hands dirty. Jen laughed. "He's with us. We're just tired. Right, Jack?" "Right," he said, almost grunting his response. "All righty," Theo said. "Well, dinner's being served, so you're just in time." "Who's cooking this round?" On a rotating roster, every week someone new had the opportunity to cook for the camp. With a head count of about 30, it wasn't an easy task. But with a few supporting hands, it meant everyone had their fair shot at providing and nourishing those whose sides they lived and fought by. Jack had been reticent to the practice at first, but soon appreciated the bonding it created. "Bradley this time," Theo replied. "So no more charred rabbit." "Thank God," Jen smirked. "We all love Billy, but he sure sucks ass at barbecuing meat." With spirits lifted, all three chuckling and exchanging quips about the culinary capabilities of their comrades, they ventured through the trenches across the camp and then climbed up to enter the largest tent. It was a huge canvas tarpaulin, camouflaged by leaves and grasses, and strung between 2 big oak trees. Under the big shelter were 3 long tables and benches for seating, all fashioned from timber harvested by Grandpa and his survivors. They were rickety and rough, but did the job. At the far end was a serving table where the food was dished out. Most in the camp were already seated when they arrived. Grandpa was at the head of the far table and rose as Theo, Jack, and Jen approached, the last to be seated. Robert, Jen's cousin, moved up to give her room, Jack taking the seat opposite Jen. Bowls of steaming stew had already been put at their places. "Glad you could join us. Now, folks, I know y'all hear me bust your asses day and night with speeches like this, but I have some good news to share." Jack looked up, curious. "We're still alive!" He yelled and laughed uproariously at his dad joke. Jack sagged in his seat as Grandpa continued. "God gives us the tools, we take them, we use them, and we keep fighting. He also gives us mercy. So, on that note, kids, I'm about to shut my damn hole. Dig in." The younger survivors giggled, whilst the attractive American Chinese woman next to him shook her head. His daughter, Haley. The fabled armorer and the adopted mother figure of the group. Dinner didn't go down as easily as Jack anticipated. His appetite was gone as old ghosts came back again to haunt him. so he offered the rest of his stew to a kid on his left, called Damien. He excused himself from the table in the midst of the post-meal chatter and weaved his way out of the tent and headed back to the woods. He didn't go far, just to a tree stump he'd sat at before, but far enough that no one would stumble across him. Suddenly, emotions overwhelmed him, and he buried his face in his hands and cried for Katie. Chapter 2, July 8th. The next morning, a faint silver ray of light broke the canopy and stirred Jack awake. Stifling a yawn, he climbed up out of his bedroll and stretched, figuring the time to be somewhere on the wrong side of 6 a.m. Stomach growling, Jack cursed himself for not finishing his dinner and ventured off toward the armory. Like clockwork, Haley was already working inside the dimly lit armory tent, beginning her morning routine of weapons cleaning and inventory. Some might call her obsessive, but Jack appreciated her attention to detail when it came to maintaining the weapons they could be called to use with a moment's notice. Back in school, he'd been part of the shooting team, and care around and for the guns had been drummed into him by his coach, Mr. Harrison. He'd also been a member of the football team, but aside from running and dodging, none of the other football skills except strategy translated to his new reality. He cleared his throat to give Haley the heads up on his approach as she handled one of the only Desert Eagles in their possession. "Morning," he yawned.
"Morning, Jack. Did you sleep okay?"
Her morning voice rasped deeper than Jack had expected it to, and though he'd gotten to know Haley quite well, it still caught him off guard occasionally, as it didn't quite match her soft features. Jack shrugged. "Enough, I guess." Haley didn't reply, dismantling the pistol into its main components on the table. To her side, she had a cloth and some oil. While he watched, she picked up a long, spindly tool that she slid inside the gun's chamber. Jack took a seat next to her, folded his arms onto the bench top, and watched silently. After a half hour, Haley had finished 2 handguns, then went to work on a rifle, one of the handful they had obtained from their raids on abandoned homes over the months. From their arsenal, Jack had been acquainted with Type 95s of varying quality. The one he started on looked like an AK-47, but he was sure it wasn't. "Type 80?" he asked. She shook her head.
"Close."
"Type 81.
"Bingo,"
she said. "But it takes the same bullets as an AK-47, right?" he said, trying to win back some points. She nodded.
"So do a lot of rifles of similar build. But I'll give you the point. Good effort."
"Nice."
"So,"
Haley said.
"what's doing with you, kid?"
"Nothing."
"Bullshit,"
she said, and her sinewy arm flexed, jerking the gas piston free.
"Look, it's none of my business, but you've been moping for weeks now. Want to do something about it? Get busy."
Jack knew she was right, but also knew that the less there was to do around camp, the more he thought about Katie and Hell Week and the rest of it. "You're right. God damn it. I just wish we were doing something." Haley held up the rifle.
Earth to Jack. We are. What do you think we're doing, holed up in the dirt? Are we making daisy chains and singing Kum fucking Baya?
Jack laughed, and Haley nodded as if she'd unlocked an achievement.
"Chin up, kid,"
she said, when she finished putting the Type 81 back together.
"We ain't dead yet. Want to help me with the inventory before the others get up?"
"Sure thing," he said, standing up and following her. Just after 8 a.m., Grandpa was in the bushes finishing his morning pee. He zipped up and put his hands on his lower back, arching it backward until he heard a loud pop.
"Much better,"
he sighed. Going back into the small enclosure he shared with his daughter, Haley, he slipped on his hiking boots, threw on a faded Stone Roses t-shirt, and brushed his teeth with a spit of water and some old toothpaste. Checking his features in a cracked piece of mirror, he gave himself a smile, watching the crow's feet extend and the frown lines deepen. That's the deal, he thought. Weary bones and wrinkles, the trade for a long life. Satisfied he was presentable, he ventured out of the small tent and walked quietly past the larger dorm tents where the kids slept, to the first trench, which sloped down into the earth and wound its way through toward the center of the camp like a main artery. Navigating it at a leisurely pace, he smiled and greeted the camp's occupants as he passed. They were nearly all teenagers, which reminded him that, despite their best efforts, they weren't able to save everyone, particularly the younger ones who were mostly dead or captured in the weeks after the invasion. He could count on one hand the children in camp under the age of 10. Instinctively, he rubbed the scar on his rib cage through the thin material of his shirt. The healed bullet wound was now a symbol of his hatred for the forces that had murdered so many and invaded his adopted home. He reached the center of the camp, a large dugout which housed most of their equipment and goods. In the event of an attack, all survivors could fall back here to defend it. It would be where they made their last stand, if it ever came to that. His beloved plane, Betsy, was stationed 3 miles away from Camp Lisa, protected from the elements and hidden under a heavy-duty and well-camouflaged tarpaulin to avoid discovery. She was literally 10 feet away from a paved access road that wound its way through the northwest section of the park. But unless you knew she was right there, she was almost invisible to the naked eye. That road, which was anything but a safe runway, was where he landed her after his last mission, rescuing Jack, Robert, and Jen. She'd been hidden well before the inevitable and prolonged aerial searches that followed the small victory. Navigating the containers of food, barrels of water, and boxes of looted supplies, Grandpa ascended the nearest steps, planks of wood jammed tight into the ground to form a rudimentary ladder, and once on ground level approached the armory, where he found his daughter elbow-deep in work with Jack. "Good morning, you two. How y'all doing?" he said. "My daughter's not working you to the bone again, is she, Jack?" Haley rolled her eyes at him.
Why don't you join us, Dad?
"I'd only shoot my toes off, you know me."
I do. Figured I'd let you remind us why you're a liability around these parts.
"Oh, really?" he cried, and elbowed Jack. "Shots fired by my own flesh and blood. What do you think about that, kid?" The banter drew a grin from Jack, whose fingers were blackened and greased from gun oil as he wrote on the paperwork beside him. He was a good kid and a good addition to the camp.
So,
Haley continued, her playful banter softening a little for a serious question.
You want me or Jack?
If Jack isn't too occupied, I'd like to borrow him for a minute or two.
Sure, we're almost done.
Jack followed Grandpa, who headed towards the food tent. So, what's up? Jack asked. All in good time. Let's eat first. Jack didn't surprise himself or Grandpa with the way he shoveled the warm oats into his mouth. Starved from not finishing last night's stew, his body craved a second helping. Between mouthfuls, he found himself wishing they could still eat toast or have the eggs they ate only occasionally with bacon. Unfortunately, the apocalypse didn't cater for dietary whims. Oats was the only thing they could feasibly stock to eat for breakfast. Like their rice and pasta stores, it had a shelf life of up to a year or two. In a place like Camp Lisa, more than a handful of chickens wouldn't work. My God, Grandpa laughed after he finished his second helping. And here I was thinking I was a little peckish. All good now, son? Jack nodded. Yes, sir. Sorry, Grandpa. It's been 6 months. You should know not to be so formal. I know, Jack said. Can't help it. It's no problem. The younger kids do it too. So, what did you want to speak to me about? Jack said, leaning his elbows onto the table and watching a group of the survivors start to collect the breakfast dishes. Outside, he could see one of the oldest, Jesse, organizing a drill exercise to keep up camp fitness, another activity that was rostered and rotated amongst the older kids. Grandpa snapped his attention away with a cough.
"Well," he said, "word has reached me, Jack, that you've not been doing so well."
Jack ran his fingers through his hair.
"Who told you that? Jen? Robert? Was it Haley?"
"It doesn't matter," the old man replied, shifting on the bench to turn and face Jack. "What matters is that we find out what's up, and we make sure you're doing okay." Jack laughed.
"Why? We're at war, hiding and fighting for our lives. My shit doesn't matter in the scheme of—"
"That's where you're wrong, son," Grandpa snapped, his voice now steely. "We need to fight not just with our hearts, but with our minds, too. If you're not firing on all cylinders, then neither are we. This ain't manning up on a football team because you broke your little toe. It's life or death. So you spill, because I guarantee your buried feelings won't stay buried for long."
"Sorry, I'm not finished."
Jack clamped his jaws shut. He hadn't been admonished by Grandpa in the entire stretch of time he'd been with them. "So, forget that man up and carry on crap. Tell me what's bothering you. And if you don't want to, or can't, then let us know you've got it, and I won't bother you again."
"Really?"
"You have my word, son." Jack let out a breath he didn't know he was holding.
"I lost someone, just like everyone else. But it's the way I lost her. It's just been on my mind lately. But we've all lost, right? I can deal with it."
Grandpa regarded him for a moment, and Jack looked down at the rough wood of the table.
"Yes, son,"
Grandpa said finally. "We've all lost someone, and we're all wired different. The loss you feel, it's real. But I need to know you'll be all right."
Listen."
Jack turned his body to face him.
"Grandpa, I get it. You need me on form, and I am. I just need something to focus on apart from hanging around this fucking place, something to take my mind off Katie. When can we fight?"
Jack took a beat.
"Sorry for swearing."
Grandpa shrugged. "We will, and when we do, you'll probably wish it was over. Back to you for now, though. You been having nightmares, too, kid?" Jack failed to hide the shock in his eyes. How had the old man known? He never cried out or screamed. Or maybe he did, and no one had said anything.
"How did—"
"A guess.
So I leave you with this, Jack. If you're where I think you're at, don't let it burn and take control. For now, find something to keep yourself occupied. I recommend something more physical than cleaning guns. It'll help take your mind off things and make you sleep better. Trust me."
Easing himself up from the bench, Grandpa gave him an affectionate pat on the shoulder and headed off to the center of the camp, waving to someone as he went. Jack remained seated, picking at a splinter at the edge of the table, grinding his teeth, and wishing he hadn't confided in Jen. There was no doubt in his mind that after his early departure from dinner the night before, she had told Grandpa or Haley of their conversation earlier in the afternoon. Chapter 3, July 9th. Jesse's training regime since day 2 in the camp had battered Jack and the others. According to Theo, it had been implemented within a matter of a week of the camp being built. The whispered rumor in late-night conversations was that a narrow escape at the start of the invasion had been largely down to poor cardiovascular fitness. They decided that would change. In the first month, Jack had struggled. In football training, he had conditioned himself to sprinting drills and weightlifting. This time, however, he needed to show endurance and pacing. The learning curve had been sharp, but his innate athleticism had saved him from too much agony. By the second month, Jesse had them jogging in varying patterns of about 5 miles to keep their location covert, and their training at a strong incline. After Grandpa's little talk and finding out Jen had spoken to him, he needed this morning's longer training run to take his mind off things more than ever. 6 months in, he comfortably ran the courses, breaking off from the rest of the pack. It regularly earned him a rebuke from Jesse, who was cautious of unnecessary danger and risk, particularly when they had to work as a single unit to survive. Jack's sense of reason was somewhat skewed. In the end, he was just a 16-year-old kid, living in post-apocalyptic America and, like everyone else, he'd lost his country and parents. But unlike a lot of them, the guilt he carried over the death of his sister tended to cast a shadow over his mood and decisions. Sometimes he just didn't think of the greater good. Bending down to tie the shoelaces of his Asics runners, treasures found at an abandoned Walmart outside Houston, Jack readied himself for that morning's 8 a.m. run. Around him were 6 others from the camp, including Robert. "So," Jessie announced, stretching her long legs before tying her dark hair up in a ponytail. "Are we ready for our 13-miler?" There was a chorus of grunts and nods, with only Jack offering a more enthusiastic reaction by way of a thumbs up. "Incredible enthusiasm, guys. Come on. Hey, look on the plus side. Our perilous lives have given us the sort of cardio fitness our old lives never gave us." "I'd still kill for a Whataburger," said Mo, a 14-year-old kid from the back of the group. Everyone laughed, even Jesse, who winked and pulled a finger gun. "Wouldn't we all, Mo? But thanks to Grandpa's decision, it's deer tonight if the hunting party gets lucky. Got it? You all good?" There were some yells of enthusiasm, including from Jack. It would be nice to have a different meat after so many months of rabbit and squirrel. Mo had lost more weight than anyone else in the camp and had really struggled early on, but perseverance and dedication had seen him become one of the fittest. "Yeah, boss, I'm ready for a PB and maybe a gold medal." "Oh, really?" Jesse laughed, turning to Jack. "You about to let this freshman beat you, Jack?" Jack shrugged. "Why not?" "Why not for sure," Jessie agreed. She made sure everyone had stretched, then checked her watch, and gave them a count before they took off south on their usual trail. The short lap of 1.5 miles around the camp meant they had to clock in a few good laps to make the 13-mile half marathon, but it was worth the overcaution to stay close to camp rather than going wider out and risking being spotted by the Chinese military in the area that they had dubbed Texas Command. Jack fell into his usual pace of 9 minutes a mile. Given he had started off on over 15 previously, he was happy with the progress. Today, though, he figured he'd play to the competition and burn some of his pent-up frustration to make it under 9 minutes. On his last outing, Jack had missed out by a hair on a sub-2-hour half marathon. Jesse had commended his fitness and encouraged him not to be discouraged, since they were on a suboptimum diet for their needs. But Jack wanted more. He needed more. With his legs pumping in an even rhythm and feet landing directly beneath his center of mass to keep his running motion efficient, Jack soon lost himself in the blur of trees whizzing by on his left and right, accompanied by the sound of undergrowth and dried twigs crunching beneath his feet. Even with an 8 a.m. start, the July heat would tax their hydration. By the time Jack had reached his 3rd mile, he was already perspiring heavily and needed to take a few deep gulps from his canteen. It had been the same last week and the week before, and Jesse had promised them a few more months of almost 100 Fahrenheit temperatures before things cooled down toward the high 70s. A figure appeared level with Jack on the 6th mile, a grin across his long, skinny face. "How about it, huh?" Mo panted. "I'm still level." "Nice,"
Jack said. Sure is hot. Jack didn't reply, focusing instead on where his feet pounded the track. A few months ago, Haley had taken a nasty fall, twisting her ankle. Being 30, some of the younger kids had teased her about old age, but they all knew that it could happen to any one of them. Phew, not even halfway yet. Save your breath, Jack said, noticing Mo had started to pant to compensate for the extra energy he was expending to talk. Right. Sorry. The awkward silence lasted as long as it took Mo to slowly drop off the pace, left behind by Jack's superior fitness and longer stride. By mile 8, Jack was alone in third place behind Jesse and Theo, who, for now at least, were the two best runners and jostling for the win. Perfect. By the last mile, his water bottle was empty, and he was drenched in sweat. When Jack finally crossed the finish line, he bent over double, hands on his knees, and wheezed. A panting Jesse came over, pouring water over him. Well done, champ. Under 2 hours? Jack asked. You bet. And only a minute behind Theo and me. How does it feel? Jack went to smile, but it suddenly occurred to him. The effort had been hollow, and he really got nothing from it. He half shrugged. I think I'll do fine. Outrunning the Chinese, that's for sure. Jessie's eyes narrowed, trying to get a read on him. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then finally tapped him on the arm. Don't forget, we have target practice before dinner tonight, when the hunting party get back. Cool, he said, without a hint of emotion. Haley pressed her thumbs into her eyes, rubbed them, then sat back down and knocked back a small measure of her dead husband's favorite whiskey. The swallow went down like water before it burned, and hit the well of her stomach, warming her through. It wasn't her usual style, pulling out the drink before the stars showed themselves, but it had been a hard day. For the sake of the kids in her and her father's care, they had to shoulder most of the responsibility of their operation without their involvement. Only Theo and Jesse had been directly involved with planning the scouting missions. The stress of being parent, teacher, friend, medic, and more had worn on her more than she cared to admit. Some of them had adapted to their new lives with hardly a second thought for the past. The struggle in the eyes of those who hadn't pained her, though, and recently, Jack's struggles had worried her the most. Sure, the other kids shared similar fates, but something in Jack's mixed feelings of grief and guilt reminded her of her husband. Their quiet stoicism was similar. Cautious of creating attachments, Haley had resolved to hide her maternal instincts. It had been hard to do with the others, and in many cases she'd lost that battle. But for Jack, she couldn't. She felt that if she gave in and fully shared in his pain, it would become hers too, and pull up memories of her old life. It would hurt too much. As selfish as that resolution was, it all came down to preservation. Knocking back another shot, she hid the bottle and cup under her things in the tent, grabbed the duffel bag of guns and ammo, and walked out of the camp towards the shooting range. Located a short walk away and calculated to be the furthest from any minor roads, it meant that they could let loose with handguns and rifles, without anyone ever hearing a thing. As an additional precaution, all firing would be done simultaneously rather than in turns, to reduce the time spent at the range and allow everyone to get their shooting in. In a small clearing ahead, huddled in front of a small wooden shelter that ran long and narrow, the running group from the morning, headed by Jesse, waited patiently for her to arrive. All right, you little soldiers, let's get our reps in. Today we're going with the QSC-92, with 9mm rounds, as sadly, that's the most we have. Then it will be turns on the AR-15 and their standard issue assault rifles, the Type 81. Remind me again, why we stick primarily with Chinese weapons? In a droning chorus,
As if repeated 1,000,000 times, the group grumbled, "To ensure we are competent with any weapon we find at our disposal." Correct. On a table before the shooting gallery structure, all guns were lined out, with their magazines to the side and empty. As part of their practice, everyone would have to load their own magazine and weapons. Over the months, Haley had guided and watched as each kid went through their drills, improving every week. She was particularly proud of the group project back in February. For a solid week, the original founders of Camp Lisa had used old fence posts and boards to construct Chinese military targets and fake environments to shoot at. It was rudimentary, but it worked. Once everyone had finished, the air was rich with the smell of cordite, and Haley watched as the students, keeping their weapons aimed down into a long sandbox, another genius addition to the shooting gallery, removed the magazines and placed them back on the table. Haley was happy and heaped praise where due in spite of her mood earlier that morning. She caught sight of Jack placing his Type 81 down with a little less care than she would have liked, and folded her arms. The kid looked happier when he was busy shooting guns, running and working on camp structures, and had been in his best moods on the few looting trips he'd made since joining. But his attitude had taken a nosedive over the last 2 weeks. "Right," Haley announced. "Good work. Theo, you need to keep that posture up and the aim will come. Jesse, perfect. Jack, great, but treat the guns with more care." She received nods and grunts in return. It looked like everyone's minds were on dinner. She didn't blame them. Hers was too. On the menu today was Grandpa's famous venison burgers. The hunting party had taken down a small deer. "Let's head back for eats," she called out after a few more minutes of shooting. She watched Jack walk on ahead, slouching with his hands stuffed into his pockets, the high of the shooting practice clearly gone already. Jesus, she thought, keeping a close eye on him. He'll enjoy the looting run tomorrow, but he really needs something more. It might be time to announce to camp what we've been planning. Chapter 4, July 10th. Jack had been impressed with just how many camping areas populated the Sam Houston National Park. So far, according to Grandpa, they'd not needed to loot outside the park since they'd set up camp, except for one troubled run to the outskirts of Huntsville. Aching from his run the morning before, he climbed out of his bedroll early morning, looking forward to joining in the bi-monthly loot run. Out on the muddy ground, Jack extended his legs one at a time, reaching down to touch his toes, stretching his hamstrings. After a few more of the moves Jesse had taught him, he felt limber enough to tackle the day. Coming out of their tent, Robert gave Jack a wave. Unlike him and Jen, once the 3 fugitives had been rescued and began living amongst other people, Jack and Robert had become a little distant. Fleeing for their lives had brought them together, but as people, the two were not particularly compatible. Still, they were on good terms, but more like roommates with a shared experience than friends. "Morning," he said. "How good were those burgers?" "Pretty dang good." "Ready for the mission?" "Sure, you?" Robert joined Jack on the walk around the outside of the camp to the planning area. Jack rubbed sleep from the corner of his eyes and pushed his hair back from his brow. It was about time to ask Haley for a haircut. Having seen some of her handiwork, he had been putting it off as long as he could. He'd heard a few people say she was improving, but he'd seen one too many Dumb and Dumber fringes to have any confidence. Robert had a big smile on his face when he saw where they would be patrolling. "What?" Jack asked. "Are you in the market for a widescreen TV?" Robert laughed and shook his head. "You know Murphy?" Jack frowned, then clicked his fingers. Quiet black girl. The one who saved Todd from drowning back in the spring." "The very same." "Oh, you like her? You're not looking to find her a gift, are you?" Robert looked offended. "Why not? Look, she told me she loves jewelry. So I thought, what better place to loot for them than in the bigger accommodation units on the south edge of the park, right? Jack shrugged. So, she likes you back? Robert's face reddened. I think so. I mean, maybe. I won't know unless I try, right? Why not just talk to her? What? Robert dropped his voice as they edged closer to the planning tent, surrounded by more of their fellow survivors. Dude, I need a fallback. She wouldn't talk to me otherwise. I'm friggin' weird. Who said you're weird? Jen. Jack laughed for the first time in what felt like days. It felt odd. Of course she's going to say that, Robert. She's family. Actually, though, he added, you are a tiny bit weird, but not enough to make it a problem with the opposite sex. Robert thumped him in the arm, and they both chuckled. Energized and eager for the mission, Jack approached the planning table and waited for Haley to finish spreading the map out. Opposite Jack, next to Haley, stood Theo, towering over them all. Next to Theo, much to Robert's chagrin, was Murphy, who was laughing at something Theo had said. Jack could practically feel the jealousy radiate from Robert. Haley clapped her hands together to silence everyone.
So, campers, it's me in charge again, and we'll be a team of 5 instead of 4, she announced loudly and jabbed her finger at the map. This will be our target.
Jack, Robert, Murphy, and Theo all leaned over to inspect the area of the map she highlighted. It was an area south of their position, clustered on the west side of Lake Livingston. Theo whistled. Cape Royale. We're sure that's a good idea? Haley narrowed her eyes at him. Sorry, he said.
Don't apologize, Theo, she said, her face softening. It's a good question. Why are we hitting Cape Royale? Why the risk?
She straightened her back, folded her arms, and looked each one of them in the eye.
Grandpa and I are planning something big. Some of you know about it, but we're keeping it under wraps until we feel it's time to divulge it to the whole camp. I know, it's all a bit cloak and dagger, but we have a few details we need to hammer out. That being said, we're going to need supplies, lots of supplies. So we need to hit a bigger cache if we want to implement our plans. Is this anything to do with the rumors about a guerrilla attack?
Murphy asked. Haley smirked, shaking her head.
You guys don't miss a trick, huh?
Robert and Theo shook their heads, and it was Jack now who felt the idiot. Apparently, he'd been so caught up in his own issues that he'd been completely ignorant to the talk around him. Haley saw his frown.
I guess not everyone, but that's fine. We were all going to find out sooner or later. Tonight will be as good a time as any.
What is it?
We call it Operation Underdog.
An uncomfortable tension started to manifest in the tent, not least from Robert, who, even though he hadn't deliberately kept it from Jack, couldn't help but feel guilty for not keeping him in the loop.
Operation Underdog will be a stealth operation against the new Chinese fuel facility. The main aim to destroy all fuel containers.
They all stared at Haley with slack jaws. Even the ones like Theo who had heard the rumors weren't aware of the ambition of the operation. He had figured it would be something big, but the plan still hit him in the gut. Jack was impressed at the scale of it, the opportunity, the risk.
It's about time we fought back, said Jack, smiling like he'd just won the lottery.
Haley held up a hand.
Easy, bucko. This isn't the time to be gunslinger. It'll be a covert, highly dangerous mission. And if all goes to plan, we won't need to fire a single shot. We want to cripple the facility and ruin their logistical operations in Texas. It may also give us further opportunities, but Grandpa will no doubt cover those tonight.
Jeez, Theo breathed. Yeah, Robert said, scratching his head. That's friggin' major. Do you know who's going on the mission? Everyone turned to Haley, completely forgetting the map and their looting plans.
"No," she said. "That's still being worked out.
She checked her watch and clapped her hands again.
For now, get your heads back in the game at hand. Our run to Cape Royale."
Over the methodical thud of the team's boots and the rustle of wind in the leaves above, hearty chatter occupied their trek southeast to Cape Royale. Despite the pep talk Haley had given them before they set out, a sense of unease stirred underneath the bravado and quiet laughter. News of the operation that might bring extra attention on them was an ominous sign that things might soon get far more perilous for the camp. By noon, they were soaked through from the heat again and had covered miles of ground, passing vacation homes they'd already raided over the last few months. Shaded by the trees, they stopped at about 1 o'clock to eat some nuts and tinned peaches, washed down with filtered water. They were in sight of Cape Royale by 3 p.m. It had been a sprawling community, with plenty of open and wooded spaces between residences. Haley decided to split them into 2 groups, and to Jack's surprise, she paired him with Theo, while she paired with Murphy and Robert. Not so bothered by the choice, Jack led the way once the groups had separated. Theo, even with his longer stride, had to motor to keep up.
"You seem keen for the mission to the fuel facility, Jack. Are you looking for action, or just wanting to stick it to the Chinese?" "Why not both?" Jack retorted, peering in through the front windows of a big double-story home to check for corpses.
The one thing they all hated finding was the dead. People who had died slumped in their chairs or beds. Given the infection had been in winter, a lot of the buildings they'd searched before had been vacant, but once you'd had the misfortune to encounter a dead homeowner, it was enough to make you wary whenever you crossed a threshold.
"All clear?" Theo asked. "As far as I can see. Let's have a look."
Balancing on his left foot, Jack kicked his right foot into the door just below the handle. It took 2 more kicks before the door buckled inwards. It bounced off the wall, and Jack neatly dodged it, sweeping his pistol left and right as he stepped inside. Haley never let them loot unarmed. Jack could hear Theo right behind him, padding as quietly as Jack, his breath steady and measured. Within a minute, they had cleared both floors and the area out back. No dead bodies, no lurking Chinese soldiers.
"Clear!"
Jack shouted from upstairs.
"Clear!"
Theo responded from outside. They went about emptying the drawers and anything under the beds. They found nothing useful like weapons or tools apart from some matches and 2 fresh packs of AA batteries, but the cupboards in the kitchen yielded a fresh supply of canned goods.
"Jackpot!"
Theo laughed.
"More peaches."
He held up a can to show Jack, adding it to his bag.
I think I've outgrown my love for him, if I'm being real with you."
"Really?" Theo said.
"I still love them."
They were silent as they finished stuffing one of the bags they were carrying.
"Well, that's this place. Might as well move on to the next."
Before the sun started to dip in the sky, Jack and Theo had raided 4 houses on the south edge of Cape Royale, and in addition to the batteries and matches from the first house, their bags were heavy with a few good knives, some medical supplies, sanitary products, and a pair of socks, along with more canned goods. They reconvened at the lake at the allotted time, and only had to wait a few minutes for Haley and the others to arrive.
"Great haul, you guys,"
Haley said, after looking over their findings.
"We found a place to bed down for the night a quarter mile east. Let's get there before we completely lose the light."
They arrived at the abandoned home, sweaty, tired, and hungry, and threw down their bags and gear in the living room. Their chatter and laughter echoed through the house as they took turns using the toilet, an unfamiliar luxury. Robert volunteered to go down to the lake with a bucket so they could flush it. Once the sun was down, they ate a light meal of cold canned beans and peas. Not the most thrilling of meals, but it was always a cold meal on a looting trip. More so now they were out of the confines of the national park. After the meal, they huddled into their sleeping bags. Jack spied Murphy looking at Robert, but he was preoccupied with his sleeping bag zip and didn't notice. "You'll have to be more aware than that, buddy," he thought. By the time Robert was satisfied with his sleeping bag, Murphy had rolled over.
"Okay, we leave at first light," Haley said. "Never in darkness."
"Never in darkness," they intoned before saying their goodnights. Chapter 5, July 11th. At the crack of dawn, Haley woke them all up. With his sleeping bag around his shoulders, Jack walked out to where she stood on the balcony overlooking the lake. A light breeze rolled up from the water, just enough to tickle the skin of his face. They watched as in silence a large flock of a small bird he couldn't put a name to swirled in random patterns over the lake. The sun crested through the trees to the east. Jack was struck by the beauty of the place. "Must have been a nice spot." Haley nodded.
"Still is, Jack. Just that there's no one around to enjoy it anymore."
Within 20 minutes, they had eaten breakfast and packed up, ready to go. And Haley was doing a final sweep of the house to make sure they'd left no sign of their brief occupancy. Jack checked his watch. It was just after 6 a.m., which meant they should make Camp Lisa by lunch.
"I nearly forgot. It's Grandpa's birthday,"
said Murphy, as they were heading off the veranda. Jack turned to catch Haley, grinning broadly.
"Sure is. Anyone want to take a guess at how old?"
Theo scrunched up his face. "I figure mid-60s?" Haley shook her head. "Late 60s? Maybe 67, 68? Robert guessed, chewing on his bottom lip. Haley laughed.
"Way off. Try another decade."
They all looked at each other, jaws dropping.
"No freaking way,"
Murphy said.
"So what, is he 80? "Yep,"
Haley congratulated.
"Hits the big 80 today. Not doing too bad, right?"
"I hope I look as good if I survive to 80, said Jack. A silence dropped over them after that. No one spoke the thought, but living in the after days, the chances of any of them living to 80 felt like fantasy at best. Not far into their trek home, someone mentioned an idea for a birthday surprise, and the somber mood lifted as they all took turns tossing around ideas. The return leg was a simple case of following their previous tracks, with the back marker, in this case Theo, tasked with obscuring their tracks as they went. It was really just to make things a little more difficult in the event someone tried to track them, and if they had dogs, it was probably ineffectual, but might slow them down a little. Sweating, with aching feet and bellies rumbling for food, they practically collapsed back into camp. After dumping their loot, Haley and Theo debriefed with Grandpa and Jesse, while the rest were dismissed to go clean up and eat. Grandpa got lots of sweaty birthday hugs and pats on the back as they filed out of the command tent. With a cloth, a small towel, and some soap, Jack was first to the camp wash and took a little time for himself in the walled-off bathroom. By the end of the first month in Camp Lisa, he'd grown used to water rationing and washing in cold water. Hot showers were just a distant and fond memory of the life he'd lost back in Sacramento. By month number 6, he couldn't begin to conceive of wasting as much water on a single wash as they had back then. How times had changed. After he finished getting changed into clean clothes, he checked the small mirror someone had left on the ledge beside the basin. It had been months since he'd looked in a mirror, and the hard, tanned face staring back at him was almost unrecognizable. It spooked him, and he threw it down before packing his gear and heading out. The haul from Cape Royal had been carefully organized, shoved into containers and recorded according to guidelines written up by Haley. The canned food was ample, filling 2 large containers.
We'll have to make a run for one of the towns nearby for clothes one of these days, Jesse muttered to Jack, as he stood on a ladder hanging up decorations on a tree for Grandpa's birthday celebrations. Really? He replied, looking down to where she was poking a finger through a hole in the belly of her t-shirt. The ladder wobbled, and he gripped the top hard. Jessie! She laughed and steadied the ladder. My bad, but sure. I mean, these looting runs have done us well for food, but not so much for anything else. We need to hit a town. Why haven't we gone back to Huntsville? You guys swarmed in to save us easy enough. Jack saw Jesse's shrug in his periphery. Huntsville was a huge risk, but we hadn't seen survivors in ages. Houston was secured and locked down by the Chinese really quickly, so you guys were definitely the exception. Grandpa had insisted, but Haley wasn't happy about it. That I can believe. Mm-hmm. So, too dangerous? Oh, for sure. They'll be keeping tabs on Huntsville and any towns close by. To be honest, I'm surprised they haven't come after us here. I'm pretty sure they would know we're somewhere in the forest. I mean, why not just burn the whole thing down? Don't wish that on us, Jack said. I guess the trouble we caused that night was just a blip on their radar. Probably way too busy occupying a whole continent to worry about a few kids in the forest. Of course, that might change once we hit their fuel facility. Jesse nodded. Oh, you heard. Yes, things will heat up then for sure, I think. You don't like the idea? I love the idea. Are you guys nearly done? Asked Robert, joining them. Yep, said Jessie, taking her hand off the ladder to sweep some hair out of her eyes. The ladder wobbled again, and because Jack was reaching out to the right, began to topple. Jack jumped free, cursing as he landed on his feet, and watched the ladder fall into the bushes. You're fired, he said to Jessie, a grin on his face. Grandpa's birthday celebration saw the camp imbued with a high-energy, fun atmosphere none of them had experienced since before the fall. The decorations, the best and rarest of their food stash cooked and laid out on the tables, and Murphy playing music for everyone on an acoustic guitar, all added to it. They were all in the mess tent, but tables had been put at one end and chairs and benches laid out around the outside. The assortment of food was impressive. Spit roasted venison, mashed potato, baked beans, fresh carrots and tomatoes, and a huge batch of mac and cheese. Full bellies and no leftovers, Grandpa had shouted as they filed in. Accordingly, no one held back. Plates were piled high, and seconds, and sometimes thirds, were the order of the day. Jack took a seat next to Jen and Robert, laughing as Grandpa tried to dance to the shaky rendition of Proud Mary that Murphy was strumming. Shaky it might have been, but it was enough to get toes tapping and hands clapping. When the song was over, there was a raucous round of applause for Grandpa and Murphy, and the old man limped over to Chair Rock, holding his lower back. The big rock that sat in the eastern corner of the mess tent had been way too big to dig out or move when they had set up camp. Grandpa had decided it was a good analogy for the stubbornness of their will to survive, and should stay right there. It stood about 5 feet high and had a flattened top with a small lip on its back edge, so it had been named Chair Rock, although Jack hadn't seen anyone sit on it besides Grandpa, so he figured it was more like a throne. Jack suspected Grandpa's limp and nursing his back was for show and to get out of more dancing rather than an actual injury, and sure enough, less than a minute after he sat down, the old man was up and heading for the food as sprightly as he ever was. Feels like forever since I had mac and cheese, Jack said, barely intelligible through large mouthfuls, waving his fork at Jen and Robert. Was it always this good? Hell yeah, Robert nodded. Jen turned up her nose. Really? I mean, come on, guys. This lot is from a can. It was never that great. Jack and Robert looked at Jen with eyebrows raised. She's lost to us, Robert whispered. Utterly, Jack agreed. Jen smirked and offered them a small shrug before finishing off her carrots. I'm right, and you know it.
On cue, Theo, from a few seats over, closer to Grandpa, raised his empty plate up in the air and yelled his undying love for mac and cheese. "Not according to Jen," called Robert.
"No, Jen, say it ain't so,"
said Theo, before resuming his seat. Jen turned bright red, which made Robert laugh. Jack nudged him to tone it down. Clearly her reaction had something to do with her maybe crushing a little on Theo. "Want to give mac and cheese another go?" Robert said, not quite ready to leave it alone. The teasing earned him a solid punch to the arm from his cousin. Leaving them to mock squabble, Jack took the opportunity to sneak back to the table and load up on some more baked beans. He dipped the ladle into the pot and then watched them pour slowly down onto the tin plate. Next to him, Grandpa cleared his throat loudly. Jack startled, sending some of the beans splattering into the dirt.
"Shit!"
Grandpa laughed.
"Steady on there, son," he said.
"You enjoying the party?" Jack laughed and put the ladle back in the big pot.
"Shouldn't I be asking you that?"
"You might."
"So, are you?"
Grandpa beamed.
"It's perfect. Makes the struggle worth it, kid. Seeing all your faces bright and alive, your soul's on fire, hungry for life. It keeps me going." "Cool. I didn't know it mattered that much. I mean, we just pitched in and stuck up some decorations." "Well, you all did a great job, and I'm thankful," Grandpa interrupted, his face suddenly serious. "Come on, leave the beans. I have an announcement to make, and I think you'll be interested. Come." Grandpa waved him back to his seat and went over to Chair Rock, nimbly climbing it and turning around to face everyone. Only a few people noticed, and he raised his hands for silence. "Speech!" one of the kids shouted in a mock British accent, getting a few laughs, and slowly everyone turned their attention to Grandpa, whose eyes twinkled in the twilight. "I want to thank you for making my birthday special. I'm happy to see my 80th out here with the best bunch of kids I've ever had the misfortune to meet." There were laughs and mock calls of boo. "Now, I have a surprise for you. We were going to announce this later, but I suppose now's a good enough time as many, so to hell with it." Jack saw Haley give him an encouraging nod from the edge. "In 7 days," said Grandpa, "we will commence Operation Underdog, our first real offensive against the invaders. A select group of you will infiltrate the new Chinese fuel facility. The aim will be to destroy their reserves and get the hell out before they can fire a shot in anger. In 7 days, we take the fight to them. It'll be dangerous and might bring them down on our heads." He looked Jack in the eye. "But in 7 days, we finally get to kick some ass." Silence fell over those assembled as they contemplated the news. "So it's finally happening?" Jessie said. "It sure is," said Haley. "And it's about time, too."